23rd August 1942, Stalingrad, Soviet Union. The sky above the Volga River turned black at precisely 1600 hours, but it wasn't the approach of night, it was death descending from above. Obergefreiter Martin Schneider watched from the western steppe as over 600 Luftwaffe aircraft, Junkers U-87 Stukas, Heinkel HE-111 bombers, and Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters filled the heavens like a swarm of steel locusts. Their engines created a roar so deafening it seemed to vibrate the earth itself. Then came the bombs. Thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries rained down on the city, turning entire neighborhoods into infernos within minutes. Flames leapt hundreds of feet into the air. The Volga itself seemed to catch fire as burning oil from shattered refineries spread across the water's surface, transforming the river into a corridor of flame. Over 40,000 civilians would die in those first hours, buried alive in collapsing buildings, burned beyond recognition, or drowned trying to escape across the burning river. Schneider, a veteran of France and Poland, felt something twist in his gut as he watched the city burn. His company commander had assured them this would be another quick victory, another conquered city to add to the Reich's growing list. But standing there, watching Stalingrad die in fire and smoke, Schneider felt something he'd never experienced before in this war, a premonition of doom. The city that bore Stalin's name was burning, and soon it would become a tomb not for Soviet defenders, but for the German Sixth Army itself. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War, stories where empires clashed, heroes emerged, and entire armies vanished into the abyss of history. Where are you watching from today? And if you'd stood on that step in August 1942, could you have imagined what Stalingrad would become, a graveyard that would swallow an entire German army? To understand how Stalingrad became the tomb for 290,000 German soldiers, we must first understand the strategic miscalculation that led them there. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, had erupted on 22 June 1941 with unprecedented fury. 3 million German troops, 3,600 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft had smashed across the Soviet border in the largest military operation in human history. The early victories were staggering. Entire Soviet armies encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners marched westward, vast territories conquered in weeks that had taken Napoleon months to traverse. But Moscow didn't fall. The Soviet capital, besieged and bombarded through the autumn of 1941, held firm. Then came the Russian winter, a season so brutal it turned German soldiers into frozen statues in their trenches. For the first time since the war began, the Wehrmacht retreated. The myth of German invincibility cracked like ice under the weight of Soviet counterattacks and temperatures that plunged to -40 degrees Celsius. Adolf Hitler, enraged by the failure to capture Moscow, recalibrated his strategy for 1942. Instead of another frontal assault on the Soviet capital, he would strike south. Operation Blue would capture the oil fields of the Caucasus, the petroleum lifeblood that kept Soviet tanks rolling and aircraft flying. Without oil, Stalin's war machine would grind to a halt. But to secure the oil fields, Hitler needed to control the flanks along the Don and Volga rivers. And sitting squarely on the Volga was an industrial city of 400,000 people, a city that bore the name of Hitler's greatest ideological enemy. Stalingrad wasn't just a strategic objective, it was a psychological prize, a propaganda weapon, a symbol that neither dictator could afford to lose. Hitler became obsessed with capturing the city. Stalin became equally obsessed with holding it, and between these two obsessions, hundreds of thousands of men would die. The mission to take Stalingrad fell to General Friedrich Paulus and his Sixth Army, one of the Wehrmacht's most prestigious formations. Paulus was 52 years old, a meticulous staff officer known for his planning skills rather than battlefield audacity. He was methodical, cautious, and utterly loyal to Hitler. His army, however, was anything but cautious. The Sixth Army comprised 13 battle-hardened divisions, over 270,000 troops who had conquered France, swept through the Balkans, and driven deep into Soviet territory. They were equipped with 500 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and backed by the Luftwaffe's devastating air power. These men believed they were the finest soldiers in the world, and they were about to march into a city that would become their collective grave. By mid-August 1942, the Sixth Army had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. The city stretched along the western bank of the Volga River like a 30-kilometer-long industrial serpent. Factories, warehouses, residential districts, and administrative buildings all pressed between the river and the steppe. German intelligence reports described it as a major industrial center, producing tanks, artillery, and munitions. Capturing it would sever Soviet transportation along the Volga and open the path to the Caucasus oil fields. The devastating air raid on 23 August was intended to break Soviet resistance before German ground forces even entered the city. Luftwaffe commanders believed the bombing would terrorize the defenders into surrender. They couldn't have been more wrong. The raid killed tens of thousands of civilians and reduced much of the city to rubble, but it also created the perfect defensive terrain for the Soviet troops who would fight there. Defending Stalingrad was General Vasily Choykov, a blunt, chain-smoking commander who took charge of the Soviet 62nd Army on 12 September. Choykov was 52, the same age as Paulus, but his personality couldn't have been more different. Where Paulus was cautious and methodical, Choykov was aggressive and pragmatic. He understood immediately that conventional defensive tactics would fail against the Wehrmacht's combined arms superiority, so he invented something new. Choykov ordered his troops to hug the Germans, to stay so close to enemy lines that the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb Soviet positions without hitting German soldiers. The distance between opposing forces shrank from hundreds of meters to 50, then 30, then sometimes just the thickness of a wall. Every building would become a fortress, every street a trench, every pile of rubble a fighting position. The Germans would call it Rottenkrieg, the War of the Rats. And in this environment, all of Germany's tactical advantages, coordinated air support, massed artillery, armored mobility, would be neutralized by the closeness of the combat. The German assault on central Stalingrad began on 13 September with a massive artillery barrage. Paulus committed his 71st and 295th Infantry Divisions, supported by the 24th Panzer Division, in a direct thrust toward the city center and the Volga riverbank. The objective seemed simple: fight through the ruins, reach the river, and split the Soviet defenders into isolated pockets that could be eliminated systematically. Reality proved far more complex. Stalingrad had been transformed by the bombing into a landscape that resembled hell itself. Buildings stood as hollow shells, their facades pockmarked with shell holes. Streets were choked with rubble, collapsed walls, twisted steel girders, burnt-out vehicles, and bodies already beginning to decompose in the September heat. The smell was overwhelming. Smoke, cordite, sewage from broken pipes, and death. Always death. German soldiers who had conquered Paris in triumph now found themselves fighting for days to capture a single apartment building. The combat was intimate, brutal, and psychologically devastating. Soviet soldiers would hide in basements, behind walls, even in sewers, then emerge to ambush German units before disappearing back into the ruins. German troops never knew where the next attack would come from above, from below, from behind a pile of rubble that looked like every other pile of rubble. One German soldier, Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann of the 267th Regiment, kept a diary throughout the battle. On 16 September, he wrote, "Stalingrad is no longer a town. By day, it is an enormous cloud of burning, blinding smoke. It is a vast furnace lit by the reflection of the flames. And when night arrives, one of those scorching, howling, bleeding nights, the dogs plunge into the Volga and swim desperately to the other bank. The nights of Stalingrad fill us with terror. Animals flee this hell. The hardest stones cannot bear it for long. Only men endure. The battle for Mamayev Kurgan, a 102-meter-high hill overlooking the city, became emblematic of Stalingrad's savagery. The hill's summit offered commanding views of the entire city and the Volga crossing points. Whoever controlled Mamayev Kurgan could direct artillery fire across the battlefield. For weeks, German and Soviet forces fought for every meter of the slope. The hill changed hands multiple times, sometimes within a single day, sometimes multiple times in a single day. Bodies piled so high that soldiers used corpses as cover. The soil became so saturated with blood and explosive residue that the earth itself turned black. Grass wouldn't grow on Mamayev Kurgan for years after the war. By late September, the Germans controlled most of the hill, but couldn't hold all of it. Soviet counterattacks, launched at night under cover of darkness and smoke, would claw back portions of the summit. The fighting was often hand-to-hand, with bayonets, entrenching tools, knives, and even bare hands. Soldiers stopped seeing the enemy as human beings. They became simply targets in a nightmare that never ended. One battle became legendary, the defense of Pavlov's house. On 27 September, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a small group of Soviet soldiers, fewer than 30 men, occupied a 4-story apartment building overlooking a key square. They were supposed to hold it for a few days until reinforcements arrived. They held it for 58 days against repeated German assaults. Pavlov's men fortified the building with barbed wire, minefields, and machine gun positions. They knocked holes through walls to create fields of fire. They connected to Soviet positions in neighboring buildings through underground passages. German forces attacked again and again, but Pavlov's house held. One German officer later wrote, "We conquered all of Europe in less time it took us to capture one apartment building in Stalingrad." As September turned to October, the battle intensified to levels of violence that defied comprehension. Paulus committed more divisions, feeding fresh troops into what veterans were already calling the meat grinder. The Soviet 62nd Army was compressed into increasingly narrow strips along the Volga, in some places only a few hundred meters deep. German soldiers could literally see the eastern riverbank. Victory seemed tantalizingly close. Paulus assured Hitler that Stalingrad would fall within days. But Chuikov's defenses held. Soviet soldiers fought with a determination born of Stalin's Order number 227, not one step back. Retreat without authorization meant execution by Soviet blocking detachments positioned behind the lines. Soldiers who showed cowardice faced firing squads. It was a brutal policy, but it worked. The 62nd Army refused to break. The Volga became Stalingrad's lifeline and its most dangerous crossing. Every night, Soviet boats and ferries crossed the river under German artillery fire, bringing reinforcements, ammunition, and supplies to Chuikov's embattled forces. German guns turned the crossing into a slaughter. Boats were hit and sank. Soldiers drowned in the cold water pulled under by their equipment. Yet the ferries kept coming, night after night, because Stalin had decreed that Stalingrad would not fall. Soviet snipers became psychological weapons. The most famous was Vasily Zaitsev, a former shepherd who was officially credited with killing 225 enemy soldiers, including 11 German snipers. His supposed duel with a German sniper instructor, Major Erwin Koenig in Soviet propaganda, became legendary, though historians still debate whether Koenig existed or was Soviet myth-making. What's undeniable is the terror Soviet snipers inspired. German soldiers moved through the ruins hunched over, darting from cover to cover, flinching at every sound. One officer wrote, "We fear their snipers more than their artillery. Shells come and go, but the snipers are always watching, always waiting." October brought the battle for the factory district. 3 massive industrial complexes dominated northern Stalingrad: the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, the Barakati gun factory, and the Red October steel plant. Incredibly, these factories continued producing tanks and weapons even as combat raged through their workshops. Workers assembled T-34 tanks in the morning, then drove them straight into battle in the afternoon, the paint still wet on their armor. Paulus launched his October offensive with everything he could muster. The Luftwaffe pounded the factories with incendiaries, turning them into skeletal frameworks of twisted steel. German infantry, supported by combat engineers with flamethrowers and demolition charges, assaulted the complexes in a desperate final push. The fighting became even more savage. Germans would control the ground floor, while Soviets held the floor above. Combat raged vertically through buildings. Grenades dropped through holes in floors. Machine guns fired through walls. Men fought and died in absolute darkness. By the end of October, the Germans controlled 90% of Stalingrad. The Soviet 62nd Army held only narrow strips along the Volga, in some places barely 200 meters deep. German troops could throw grenades into the river. Paulus reported to Hitler that final victory was imminent, just days away. But those final few hundred meters proved impossible to capture. And while the Sixth Army exhausted itself in Stalingrad, something was happening beyond the city, something German intelligence had completely failed to detect. For months, while German forces ground forward through Stalingrad, Soviet High Command had been planning a counterstroke of unprecedented scale. General Georgy Zhukov, Stalin's most capable military strategist and the architect of Moscow's defense, had identified the critical weakness in Germany's position. The flanks were held by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies equipped with obsolete weapons and lacking adequate anti-tank defenses. Throughout October and November, the Soviets secretly assembled over 1 million troops, 13,500 artillery pieces, 900 tanks, and 1,400 aircraft in positions north and south of Stalingrad. The buildup happened in forests and ravines beyond German reconnaissance range, under strict operational security. German intelligence detected some activity, but catastrophically underestimated its scale. Paulus and his staff, consumed by the battle in the city, dismissed warnings as Soviet propaganda. Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive, launched on 19 November 1942 at exactly 7:30 a.m. The frozen steppe north of Stalingrad erupted as 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. For 80 minutes, Soviet guns systematically destroyed Romanian defensive positions. Command posts were obliterated, communications were severed, entire battalions simply ceased to exist, their soldiers killed in their trenches before they could return fire. Then came the armor. Soviet T-34 medium tanks and KV-1 heavy tanks, superior in many respects to German armor, crashed through the shattered Romanian lines. Romanian anti-tank guns, mostly obsolete 37mm weapons, were nearly useless. Romanian soldiers fought with desperate courage, but they were overwhelmed within hours. Some units resisted to the last man. Others broke and fled across the frozen steppe. 24 hours later, on 20th November, the southern pincer struck with equal force. Soviet forces shattered the Romanian Fourth Army and portions of the German 4th Panzer Army's extended positions. Again, massive bombardment. Again, armored breakthrough. Again, defensive collapse. Soviet tank columns raced westward across open steppe, covering 60 to 70 kilometers in 2 days. German units scrambled to respond, but were scattered and too slow. On 23 November at approximately 4 p.m., Soviet forces from the northern and southern pincers met at Kalak on the Don, a town 50 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The encirclement was complete. The entire German Sixth Army, over 290,000 soldiers, was trapped inside a pocket 60 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers deep. Along with them were portions of the 4th Panzer Army, 2 Romanian divisions, and various support units. They were cut off from supply, surrounded by Soviet forces, with winter descending and no escape route. The hunters had become the hunted. Friedrich Paulus received confirmation of the encirclement on 23 November. His immediate instinct was correct. The Sixth Army had to break out immediately while the Soviet ring was still weak. His mobile units still had fuel and ammunition. The weather was cold, but not yet deadly. A breakout within 48 hours could save most of the army. Paulus sent urgent messages to Hitler requesting permission to withdraw westward, but Adolf Hitler, at his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, absolutely refused. Stalingrad bore Stalin's name. Abandoning it was psychologically and politically unacceptable. Moreover, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring made a catastrophically reckless promise. The Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army by air, delivering 500 tons of supplies daily, the minimum needed.
It was a fantasy. The Luftwaffe possessed barely 750 transport aircraft across all theaters. The nearest functional German airfields were over 200 kilometers away. Soviet anti-aircraft defenses were formidable. Winter weather would ground aircraft for days at a time. But Hitler believed Göring. On 24th November, he issued the order that doomed 290,000 men. The 6th Army will hold Stalingrad and await relief from outside. Paulus, the loyal staff officer, obeyed. The airlift began on 25th November and immediately failed. Only 22 Junkers U-52 transports reached the pocket that first day, delivering 30 tons, 1/16 of requirements. Soviet fighters shot down German planes in droves. Blizzards grounded squadrons. Aircraft that landed often delivered the wrong supplies, champagne and decorations instead of bread and ammunition. By early December, the airlift averaged 100 tons daily, 1/5 of needs. Inside the pocket, German soldiers began to starve. Rations were cut to 300 grams of bread per day, then 200, then 100. Men who had marched into Stalingrad as conquerors now scavenged for food like animals. The horses were slaughtered first. Thousands of them, used for transportation, were systematically killed for meat. Every part was used: meat for food, hides for clothing, bones for soup. When the horses were gone, soldiers ate anything. Leather belts boiled to paste, boot soles, wallpaper scraped from buildings for the flour in the paste. Rats. One doctor wrote, "We have ceased to be an army. We are dying men pretending to be soldiers." Winter descended with merciless fury. Temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius. German troops, lacking adequate winter clothing, wrapped themselves in rags and Soviet greatcoats stripped from corpses. Frostbite claimed thousands. Fingers and toes turned black. Disease spread. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia. Field hospitals overflowed, but doctors had no supplies. Surgeons performed amputations without anesthesia. The screams echoed through frozen basements. In mid-December, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, a desperate relief attempt. His elite 6th Panzer Division smashed through Soviet lines and advanced toward Stalingrad. By 19th December, they reached the Mishkava River, just 48 kilometers from the pocket. Radio messages crackled. "Relief is coming. Hold on." Manstein urged Paulus to break out and meet the relief force, but Paulus hesitated. Hitler had ordered him to hold Stalingrad. Breaking out meant abandoning the city. Paulus requested permission. Hitler's response? Remain in position. Days passed. Soviet forces counterattacked Manstein's spearhead with overwhelming strength. The 6th Panzer Division, exhausted and low on fuel, couldn't advance further. On 23rd December, Manstein withdrew. Inside the pocket, men wept. They'd been 48 kilometers from salvation. January 1943 brought the endgame. The Soviets launched Operation Ring, systematic destruction of the German pocket. On 10th January, 7,000 Soviet guns bombarded German positions. Infantry and tanks advanced methodically, overrunning defenses. Germans fought desperately, but they were starving, freezing, out of ammunition. Units that had numbered thousands were reduced to dozens. On 24th January, the pocket was split in two. On 30th January, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to commit suicide. But on 31st January, Soviet troops stormed Paulus's bunker. he surrendered the southern pocket. On 2nd January, the northern pocket capitulated. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of 290,000 soldiers encircled in November, approximately 91,000 survived to surrender. Nearly 200,000 died in the pocket, from combat, starvation, disease, and cold. Of those captured, only about 6,000 ever returned home. The rest died in Soviet POW camps. Stalingrad became a tomb for 290,000 Germans because of catastrophic leadership failures. When encirclement occurred, escape was possible, but Hitler refused, clinging to the city's symbolic value and accepting Goring's empty promises. His refusal to authorize breakout during the relief operation sealed the army's fate. He valued propaganda over lives, ideology over military reality. The soldiers of the Sixth Army were ordinary men, fathers, brothers, sons, who believed they served honorably. They deserved leaders who made rational decisions. Instead, they were sacrificed for Hitler's pride. One soldier's final letter captured the tragedy. "We came believing in victory. We stayed because we were ordered. We are dying because our leaders refused to face reality." The strategic consequences were immense. Germany lost an entire field army, 24 generals, 2,500 officers, 290,000 troops. The Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility shattered. German morale cracked. For the Soviets, Stalingrad proved the Red Army could win decisively. From Stalingrad onward, Germany retreated, slowly, bloodily, but inevitably, toward defeat. The city that bore Stalin's name became a tomb, not for Soviet defenders, but for Hitler's finest army, buried under the rubble of strategic incompetence and ideological obsession. When we remember Obergefreiter Martin Schneider watching the city burn on 23rd August, we see a man at the beginning of a journey into hell, a journey his leaders made inevitable. Stalingrad became a tomb because leaders chose to make it one, because pride cost 290,000 lives, because ideology triumphed over humanity. But while Stalingrad consumed the Eastern Front, another pivotal campaign was unfolding in the Pacific, where American forces faced an equally determined enemy in steaming jungles that seemed designed to kill. Join us next time as we uncover the brutal 6-month struggle for Guadalcanal, the battle that proved America's resolve could never be broken, no matter the cost. Subscribe now and never miss a story from the war that shaped our world forever.